At 3:14 p.m. on February 7, 1962, in a second-floor interrogation room at 17 West 126th Street. The clock's second hand clicked loud enough to feel like a threat, and that was when Bumpy Johnson smiled. Not wide, not defiant, just enough to break the rhythm of the men across the table who had been pressing him for hours. Their jackets off, ties loosened, coffee rings drying into pale halos on scarred wood. Imagine sitting there with no windows. Fluorescent lights humming a folded copy of the New York-Amsterdam News confiscated and left face down like a warning. Detectives trading questions the way boxers trade jabs, faster. Shaper each one meant to land until that smile arrived at minute 9 and changed the temperature of the room. Because smiles don't belong in places built for fear. Outside Harlem, buses sighed at stops, unaware that inside this room pressure was failing, that authority was leaking out through a gesture too small to write into any report. And the men who needed control most had just lost it. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. As you listen, tell us your local time and where you're watching from in the comments, because this story didn't unfold in isolation. It unfolded while a city breathed, waited, and quietly understood what that smile meant. The room had no windows, no clock on the wall, only the detectives' watches turning time into a private weapon. And by 3:27 p.m., the air smelled faintly of burnt coffee and wool coats. Drying too slowly, a detail that mattered because discomfort was part of the design. The table was bolted to the floor. The chairs were not. And every scrape of metal legs became a punctuation mark in a conversation that wasn't really a conversation at all. Just pressure applied in measured doses. Questions asked, repeated, then asked again with different verbs. One detective kept his pen uncapped but never wrote, letting the blue ink dry on its tip. Another folded and unfolded a confiscated notebook. Not to read it, just to remind the man across from them that his thoughts could be taken and handled by strangers. The facts were precise, delivered calmly, dates, addresses, names spoken once and never explained because explanation would imply weakness, and weakness had no place here. Statistically, Harlem arrests had risen nearly 18% in the previous year, a number cited aloud as if it were personal, as if the city itself were leaning into the room to listen. And yet the man in the chair never shifted his posture, never corrected a detail, never denied anything outright, choosing instead the slower violence of silence. By the fourth repetition of the same question, a detective's knuckles whitened around his coffee cup. The liquid inside, untouched long enough to form a thin skin, and that tiny neglect betrayed more than any raised voice could have. Pressure is supposed to narrow options, but here it began to widen them, stretching the room until authority felt thin, almost translucent. Outside the station at exactly 3:41 p.m., a delivery truck stalled on Lenox Avenue and blocked traffic for 6 minutes, a coincidence. No one inside could see yet. It mirrored the moment perfectly. Movement halted, engines idling, impatience building without release. This was supposed to be an interrogation. A linear process with a confession waiting at the end. But it was quietly becoming something else, a test of endurance, where the detectives were discovering minute by minute that control requires belief from both sides. And belief was slipping, not dramatically, not all at once, but the way heat escapes a closed room through cracks you only notice when the cold finally reaches you. By early evening, February 7, 1962, the detectives understood the arithmetic of the day had changed because interrogations are supposed to accumulate facts, not expose need, and now need was visible in the way files were opened too quickly and closed too hard. They cited numbers the city loved. Clearance rates hovering near 62% for violent crimes that winter. An average interrogation length of just under 2 hours, the promise that cooperation shaved months off indictments. Statistics delivered like lifelines. Each one meant to pull the man across the table toward a safer shore, yet every figure landed flat, absorbed without comment. A folded newspaper lay between them, creased so sharply it could cut skin. Its headline about rising rents in Harlem, an accidental reminder that pressure existed everywhere, not just in this room, and that some men learned long ago how to live inside it. One detective shifted tactics, softening his voice, offering coffee that had already gone bitter. An everyday kindness that arrived too late to be credible, while another leaned back and let silence stretch until it became a third presence, heavy and judgmental. The logistical chain was simple and brutal. Hold question, isolate, repeat. But it relied on momentum, and momentum was gone, replaced by something harder to name, a quiet confidence that did not announce itself or seek approval. At 5:02 p.m., a supervisor stepped in, briefly said nothing of substance, and left a manila folder on the table without opening it. A gesture meant to suggest depth, resources, inevitability, yet the folder remained untouched, its power purely symbolic and therefore fragile. Historically, fewer than 1 in 5 interrogations at that precinct produced immediate actionable intelligence, a ratio everyone in the room knew, but no one admitted aloud, and that unspoken knowledge pressed against them, now eroding certainty. When the same question came again, phrased for the 5th time, the man in the chair finally looked up. Not angry, not amused, just attentive, as if listening to a familiar song played slightly out of tune. And in that moment the detectives felt it, the realization that they were no longer extracting information, but revealing themselves, their urgency, their limits, their dependence on an outcome that was no longer guaranteed. Authority, when it senses its own dependence, begins to negotiate with silence, and silence does not bargain, it waits. As night settled over Harlem at 6:18 p.m., streetlights flickered on in uneven succession, creating pockets of light and shadow that felt intentional even when they weren't. And inside the station, the shift change brought new footsteps. New coats hung on the same pegs, and the quiet judgment of officers who didn't need to ask why the room was still occupied. Outside, barbers swept hair into piles the size of folded newspapers. Card games resumed on stoops despite the cold, and word moved without words because Harlem had always understood how to listen for pressure the way sailors listen for wind. Statistically, nearly 70% of residents within a 6-block radius had lived there more than a decade, a density of memory that meant events like this were felt before they were explained, and that mattered now because no siren sounded. No crowds gathered, just a subtle slowing, a collective awareness that something important was being decided behind brick and glass. Back inside, a detective removed his badge and set it on the table, not as surrender, but as intimacy. A small, everyday gesture meant to humanize authority. Yet it landed awkwardly, the metal catching the light too sharply, reminding everyone that symbols lose power when overused. A cigarette pack sat unopened in a jacket pocket despite the craving it promised, a choice made consciously because even nicotine felt like a concession tonight. The question shifted again, away from specifics toward hypotheticals, toward stories that invited correction. A known technique designed to trigger pride or irritation. But the responses never came, only attentive listening, the kind that forces the speaker to hear himself. Outside, a busker played a slow blues riff near 125th Street Station, repeating the same 4 bars until passers-by stopped noticing the music and started feeling it, and that repetition mirrored the room perfectly. Pressure looping without resolution. Fewer than 12% of high-profile interrogations in Manhattan that year resulted in immediate charges without corroboration, a statistic buried in annual reports but alive in the instincts of every man present because they could feel the hours slipping past usefulness. When a detective finally checked his watch and exhaled, it wasn't frustration that showed, it was recognition, the kind that arrives when you realize the audience you thought you controlled has been watching you just as closely, measuring not your words but your patience, your restraint, and the subtle ways power reveals its own fatigue. By 7:03 p.m., the coffee had gone cold enough to be abandoned, a thin ring marking where one cup had sat too long, and the detectives felt the subtle humiliation of repetition because authority depends on progress, and nothing in this room was moving forward. The same questions returned, dressed in softer language, then sharper, then oddly philosophical. Each pass stripping away confidence rather than adding pressure. And somewhere between those cycles, the men with badges began adjusting in their chairs. Not for comfort, but for reassurance. One cleared his throat before speaking, Another glanced toward the door as if expecting permission that would never come, and those micro-movements mattered because interrogations are performances where the smallest tells are noticed and stored. Historically, less than 9% of extended interrogations beyond 4 hours in New York produced reliable testimony. A figure never cited aloud, but felt now in the thinning patience of the room. And yet the process continued because stopping would mean admitting the smile at minute 9 had done irreversible damage. A legal pad lay open with 3 lines written and crossed out, a rare visible mistake, and the act of striking words revealed doubt more clearly than any confession could have. The emotional contrast sharpened here, not in anger, but in restraint, because the man in the chair offered nothing, except presence and calm so complete it forced the others to confront their own motivations. Were they here to uncover truth to satisfy supervisors, or simply to win? This is where the story turns outward, where the audience becomes part of the room, because you can feel the imbalance forming, and the question presses quietly but insistently. If pressure reveals character whose character is actually being tested now. Another pause longer than the rest settled in, stretching, until even the hum of the lights felt accusatory. And in that silence, a second question emerged. Less comfortable than the first, what happens to authority when the person it interrogates refuses to acknowledge its urgency? Outside, Harlem continued its evening rituals, unaware that inside this room, the detectives were negotiating not with a suspect, but with the limits of their own power. Discovering too late that pressure applied without belief rebounds inward. The section ends not with a statement or a statistic, but with that unanswered space hanging between men who suddenly understood that control, once questioned, rarely returns intact. Sometime after 8:11 p.m., the room crossed a line. No one announced, the kind you only recognize later when reports fail to explain outcomes, because the mechanics of pressure had inverted and the detectives were now reacting rather than directing. A fresh pot of coffee arrived, untouched its steam, briefly fogging the air before thinning into nothing. A visual echo of effort without effect, and the chair across the table creaked as one detective leaned forward, then stopped himself, catching the impulse mid-motion as if restraint itself had become the new rule. The psychological shift was quiet, almost polite, marked by smaller gestures. A badge nudged back into a pocket. A pen finally capped a jacket put on again, despite the heat signals that posture was changing, even if language had not. Historically, internal reviews later showed that nearly 40% of stalled interrogations ended not because evidence failed, but because confidence did a statistic buried in departmental summaries. Yet tonight it was unfolding in real time, visible in the way questions shortened then stopped altogether. The man in the chair adjusted his cuff once, slowly, deliberately, an everyday motion that reclaimed time and in doing so, reasserted control without saying a word. The detectives felt it as a loss of tempo, like musicians realizing they were no longer setting the beat, and that recognition carried weight because tempo governs authority more than volume ever could. A supervisor passed the open door and did not enter a decision as meaningful as any command acknowledging without ceremony that the room had reached its limit. Paperwork was shuffled not to progress the case but to give hands something to do, and in that mundane activity the transformation completed itself. The interrogation had become an observation, the observers unsure of their role. The statistic that mattered most now was never written down, the number of minutes since anyone believed this would end in their favor, and that number was growing. When silence returned, it was no longer a tactic, but a condition, and everyone felt the difference. The power shift did not announce itself with anger or triumph, only with a shared understanding that something irreversible had occurred that minute. 9 had echoed forward through the evening and settled here. The section closes on an image rather than a conclusion, the overhead light flickering once before stabilizing, illuminating a room where authority still sat at the table but no longer owned it. At 9:02 p.m., February 7th, 1962. The door finally opened, not abruptly, not ceremonially, but with the soft mechanical click of a latch released by routine rather than decision. And that detail mattered because it stripped the moment of drama while giving it weight. Paperwork was gathered slowly. Pages aligned twice before being tucked into a folder that still contained Nothing decisive, and a chair was pushed back with care, as if noise itself might undo what the evening had settled. No charges were read, no threats issued, no victories claimed, only a brief exchange of looks that avoided the center of the table where authority had quietly thinned. Statistically, fewer than 6% of prolonged interrogations ending this late-produced follow-up action within 48 hours, a number known instinctively here, and it explained the careful neutrality of the men, standing now, the way their shoulders carried acceptance rather than resolve. A coat sleeve brushed the edge of the table, smearing a dried coffee ring into an indistinct shape, erasing the only visible mark of the hours spent. And that small accidental gesture felt symbolic, because history often cleans itself up before anyone agrees on what it meant. In the hallway, footsteps sounded different, less purposeful, echoing longer than expected, and no one spoke as they moved, not out of respect but out of uncertainty, because words would have implied interpretation. The man who had smiled at minute 9 adjusted his hat before stepping forward, a familiar motion reclaimed from routine life, and that was the final transformation. The return to normalcy that confirms power has shifted. Outside, the night air carried the ordinary sounds of Harlem, distant music, a passing car, laughter cut short by cold, and those sounds absorbed the moment completely, leaving no trace except memory. The interrogation did not end with resolution or consequence, only with the understanding that something intangible had been decided, something no transcript could capture. The door closed again softly, and the silence it left behind was not empty but settled like dust after a long disturbance, asking no questions, offering no answers, and lingering long after everyone had gone. Long after that February night faded into routine paperwork and forgotten shifts. The meaning of those hours remained unsettled, not because nothing happened, but because what happened could not be easily measured, archived, or proven. History often teaches us to look for outcomes, charges filed, cases closed, victories claimed. But the truth is quieter. Living in gestures that never reach the page, in moments where power realizes its limits and adjusts without ceremony. The smile at minute 9 did not end an interrogation. It revealed a boundary, the fragile line where authority requires belief, and belief quietly withdraws. This is how forgotten legends survive, not through spectacle, but through memory passed hand to hand. Whispered in barbershops, carried in the way, a neighborhood pauses when it senses pressure being applied somewhere unseen. The detectives went home that night to families, radios, late dinners growing cold on stoves while Harlem continued breathing, absorbing the outcome without ever needing an explanation. History remembers wars and laws, but it is shaped just as often by rooms without windows, by silence, stretched too far, by men discovering that control cannot be forced indefinitely without changing the person who applies it. These moments linger because they mirror something human and uncomfortable, the realization that power is not owned, only borrowed, and that it can slip away without warning, without sound. Memory, like authority, depends on who is listening, and tonight you have listened closely enough to stand in that room to feel the hum of the lights, the cooling coffee, the weight of time pressing in both directions. Carry that awareness forward, because history is not only what happened, but how it was felt, and some truths survive precisely because they were never written down.